Murder at Thornbury Academy, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome back to Velvet Clues, the place where mysteries unravel and truth emerges from shadows. I'm your narrator, Connor, and tonight we have an exceptional tale for you. Settle into your favourite chair with your beverage of choice and prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of literary deception and a crime most carefully concealed. We'll be following the remarkable Miss Jane Marple as she navigates the treacherous waters of academia, where ambition can poison the mind, and apparently much more besides. This is the story of what happened at Thornbury Academy, where a retirement celebration became a stage for murder, and a simple chocolate apple became an instrument of deadly justice. Now then, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Golden Anniversary That Turned to Ash. The autumn afternoon at Thornbury Academy had arrived with all the ceremonial weight that such occasions demanded. The great hall of the distinguished school, where generations of young minds had been shaped and occasionally moulded according to less noble purposes, had been transformed into something approaching celebration. Cream-coloured bunting decorated the walls, and long tables groaned under the weight of catered delicacies, each item selected with the care one might apply to honouring 40 years of distinguished service. Miss Jane Marple, invited as a distinguished guest by her former colleague and dear friend Margaret Hastings, observed the proceedings with her characteristic attention to detail, noting far more than most observers might consider worthy of notice. She had positioned herself in a corner of the great hall, where she could observe both the gathering crowd and the various attendees, as they mingled with what she judged to be varying degrees of genuine affection. The retiring teacher, Miss Constance Whitmore, stood near the centre of the assembly dressed in lavender silk that probably cost more than a reasonable person might spend on such things. Her silver hair had been carefully arranged, and her face bore the expression of someone who had grown accustomed to admiration and had no intention of relinquishing such a pleasant circumstance. 40 years, Margaret was saying, her voice carrying that particular enthusiasm reserved for old friends and significant milestones. 40 years of dedicated service to this institution. I can scarce believe the time has passed so rapidly. Constance smiled with the practised warmth of someone who had delivered similar remarks many times before. Though I confess, I am ready to embrace the quieter pursuits that retirement promises, a respite from the constant demands of shaping young minds. Miss Marple listened to this exchange with interest, noting something in the slight stiffness of Constance's expression that suggested her anticipation of retirement might be more complex than simple relief. The retiring teacher moved through the gathering with a confidence of long familiarity, greeting former colleagues and current staff members with remarks tailored to each individual. Yet Miss Marple observed how several of these interactions carried an undercurrent of tension, particularly when Constance addressed certain members of the younger faculty. One such moment occurred when she encountered a woman Miss Marple judged to be in her middle 30s, with dark hair and an expression of carefully controlled anger. "Laura," Constance said, her voice warm but her eyes measuring, "how lovely that you could make it to the celebration. I do hope teaching has provided you with adequate satisfaction." Laura's response was brief and measured. "Constance, I'm sure your retirement will provide everyone with considerable relief." The remark hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Miss Marple found herself wondering what history lay beneath such a barbed exchange. Margaret appeared beside Miss Marple with 2 glasses of champagne, apparently unaware of the tension that had just concluded. "I'm so glad you could attend, Jane. I know these sorts of functions aren't particularly your preference, but Constance was adamant that you be invited. She has always spoken so highly of your observations regarding human nature." "Most flattering," Miss Marple replied, accepting the champagne with a gracious nod. "Though I confess I find myself curious about some of the dynamics at play within the academy. The teaching profession must present considerable challenges." Margaret sipped her own champagne thoughtfully. "More than you might imagine. Constance is a complex woman, brilliant certainly, and her publications on creative writing pedagogy have been quite influential. Yet there have been occasional whispers about her methods, nothing concrete, you understand, merely the sort of professional gossip that circulates in any institution. Such as what variety of whispers? Miss Marple inquired gently, already sensing that the answer would prove illuminating. Well, some younger teachers have suggested that Constance's remarkable productivity, her numerous essays, and even that rather celebrated book on developing student potential might not represent entirely original work, but really it's speculation without evidence, rather unfair to repeat. The luncheon portion of the celebration passed with the predictable mixture of praise and platitude that such events typically involved. The headmaster delivered remarks emphasizing Constance's contributions to the Academy's reputation and her innovative approaches to fostering creative excellence. Several of her former students rose to offer testimonials, each describing how her guidance had shaped their subsequent careers. Yet Miss Marple observed that several of these students smiled without warmth, and their remarks, while technically complimentary, seemed to contain subtle barbs that only careful listeners might detect. As the formal program concluded, attention turned to the dessert table, where an array of confections had been displayed with considerable artistry. Chocolate eclairs, strawberry tarts, and various pastries had been arranged in appealing formations, but what drew particular attention were the chocolate apples. These were substantial constructions, each a red apple crafted entirely from chocolate and artfully polished until they gleamed beneath the hall lights. They had been positioned on a separate small table with a tasteful card, indicating they were from Delightful Confections, the bakery that had provided the entire catered spread. "Those apples are remarkable, aren't they?" Margaret commented, appearing beside Miss Marple with a plate containing various selections. The bakery apparently spent hours on each one. Constance has always had a weakness for chocolate apples. I believe they're her absolute favourite. Several guests were already sampling the other desserts, but Constance herself made her way directly to the chocolate apple table, with the single-mindedness of someone moving toward a beloved indulgence. She selected the largest apple from the arrangement, one that gleamed with particular brilliance, and examined it with obvious pleasure. The stick was crafted from some sort of decorative material, Miss Marple noted, rather thicker than an ordinary apple stick, and appeared to be quite skillfully worked. "Well then," Constance announced to those nearby, "I shall indulge myself properly. 40 years of restraint surely deserves some compensation." She raised the chocolate apple in a small toast before taking a bite from the side of the fruit. The taste appeared to please her, and she consumed the apple with evident satisfaction, eventually finishing the entire confection. Miss Marple observed this performance with the peculiar intensity she reserved for moments when she sensed something amiss, though she could not precisely identify what troubled her about the scene. It was perhaps 10 minutes later that Constance appeared at the side of the hall, speaking briefly with Margaret before moving toward the interior corridor that led to the Academy's offices and private spaces. She seemed to be in good spirits, though Miss Marple noted that she walked with perhaps slightly less grace than she had exhibited earlier in the afternoon. Another 5 minutes elapsed, and then a member of the catering staff returned to the great hall, her expression one of considerable distress. She spoke urgently to the headmaster, who immediately rose and excused himself, his face shifting rapidly from curiosity to concern. "Margaret," Miss Marple said quietly, grasping her friend's arm. "Something has happened, something quite serious, I suspect." Within moments, the celebration had transformed from festive gathering to scene of confusion and alarm. The headmaster reappeared and announced in a strained voice that Miss Whitmore had taken ill quite suddenly and that an ambulance was being summoned. Several guests moved toward the corridor to offer assistance, while others stood uncertainly, their festive mood replaced by the awkwardness that such disruptions typically produce. Miss Marple found herself following Margaret into the corridor, where she discovered Constance Whitmore collapsed on the small sofa in her private office, her complexion an alarming shade of grey, her breathing rapid and shallow, her eyes fixed on something only she could perceive. The school's nurse, Miss Harrison, was kneeling beside her, attempting to determine whether there was anything immediately helpful she could offer. "Constance," the nurse was saying, "can you hear me? What happened?" Constance's lips moved, but no coherent sound emerged. Her body seemed to be experiencing some form of convulsion, not violent, but clearly involuntary, as though her nervous system was receiving instructions it did not know how to properly execute. Within the next quarter hour, the ambulance had arrived and Constance Whitmore had been transported to the county hospital with considerable urgency. The celebration had been hastily concluded, and the remaining guests dispersed with the uncertain manner of people uncertain whether continuing to enjoy themselves would be appropriate under such circumstances. Miss Marple stood in the now empty great hall, examining the dessert table with careful attention. The chocolate apples had been partially consumed by various guests, with several remaining uneaten. The plate from which Constance had selected hers showed no obvious signs of anything amiss, and the remaining apples appeared entirely ordinary, insofar as chocolate constructions of such quality and artistry might be considered ordinary. Margaret approached her with an expression of deep concern. "The hospital telephone is ringing constantly now. It appears Constance's condition is quite grave. The doctors cannot immediately determine what has caused her collapse. Did she consume anything unusual at the celebration?" Miss Marple considered the question with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "The chocolate apple," she said finally. "She consumed one of the chocolate apples entirely. Was there anything particular about that apple that distinguished it from the others?" Margaret frowned. "I don't believe so. They all appeared identical to my eye, though perhaps the bakery might recall which particular apple she selected. Such a dreadful thought that the food itself might be responsible." As they prepared to depart the academy, Miss Marple reflected that the afternoon's events had shifted from celebration to mystery with remarkable speed. A retiring teacher taken ill after consuming a chocolate apple, a guest list that included at least one person who harboured clear resentment toward the victim, and questions that demanded answers about why someone would poison a woman on her retirement day, and whether that poisoning had been intended or whether it represented something far more calculated. The mystery, Miss Marple thought, was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Poison tastes sweetly of deception. The county hospital's austere corridors provided Miss Marple with the familiar atmosphere of institutions dedicated to the preservation of life. She had arranged to visit the hospital early the following morning, having received word that Constance Whitmore remained in serious condition, but had achieved partial consciousness during the night. The medical staff, though cautious about her prognosis, had indicated that they might have obtained sufficient information from the patient to determine the nature of the poison that had rendered her so gravely ill. Dr. Fielding, a man of perhaps 60 with the tired demeanour of someone who had devoted his career to fighting against the randomness of human physiology, received Miss Marple in his consultation room with the courtesy extended to distinguished visitors of advanced years. "The substance found in Miss Whitmore's blood is cyanide," he informed her without preamble. "A remarkably pure form, I might add, which suggests it was administered by someone with considerable knowledge of poisons. She appears to have ingested it approximately 3 hours before her collapse, which places the moment of poisoning during the afternoon celebration." "Cyanide," Miss Marple repeated, noting the particular cruelty of such a choice. "An extremely efficient poison, though one that requires either considerable courage or considerable desperation to employ." Dr. Fielding nodded grimly. "Indeed. Additionally, the poison appears to have been introduced through a vehicle that would normally be considered quite innocent. The traces we have been able to identify suggest the poison was concentrated in some fatty or oily substance, possibly chocolate or something with similarly protecting properties." "The chocolate apple," Miss Marple concluded. "Someone injected the poison through the stick, allowing the protective qualities of the chocolate coating to mask the presence of the cyanide until it had been consumed and the poison reached Miss Whitmore's system." "Precisely." The doctor examined her with new respect. "You are well versed in the mechanics of poisoning, Miss Marple. I confess to spending a lifetime observing human behaviour and the various crimes that spring from it," she replied modestly. "Though I must confess that cyanide poisoning at a public celebration presents certain complications that more private murders do not typically involve. Such poisonings require either considerable confidence that one particular person would consume one particular target, or they require considerable indifference to the possibility of harming innocent parties as well. That is an astute observation." Dr. Fielding rose and moved to his window, which overlooked the hospital gardens with their autumn bare trees and carefully arranged stone benches. We have been attempting to obtain information from Miss Whitmore regarding her interactions on the day of her collapse. Her memory of events immediately preceding the poisoning is somewhat fragmentary, but she has repeatedly mentioned seeing someone she recognized near the chocolate apple table, a person she could not initially identify. Did she provide any further description? Miss Marple inquired. Tall, she said, with dark hair and an expression of what she termed bitter satisfaction. She also mentioned that this person seemed familiar in some way that troubled her. It was as though seeing this individual had awakened some uncomfortable memory that she could not quite grasp. Miss Marple processed this information with the careful attention she habitually applied to puzzle pieces that seemed to have no obvious connection to the design they were meant to form. A person at the celebration who bore both enough familiarity to achieve recognition and enough resentment to justify attempting murder. The question becomes not whether such a person existed, but rather why they possessed such profound motivation. She rose from her chair, collecting her handbag with practiced grace. Dr. Fielding, I wonder whether I might examine the chocolate apple that Miss Whitmore consumed. I assume your medical staff has preserved it as evidence. The doctor hesitated briefly, then nodded. The remains are in our laboratory. I shall arrange for you to be permitted to examine them. But I must ask, Miss Marple, are you connected with the police investigation? Not officially, she replied with a gentle smile, though I have found that the police are often willing to tolerate the observations of those with sufficient age and apparent harmlessness. I represent only my own curiosity and my concern for the nature of the crime that was committed. The laboratory proved to be a surprisingly modest space, far less mysterious than Miss Marple might have imagined. The remains of the chocolate apple rested on a metal surface, partially consumed on the side but largely intact. What struck Miss Marple immediately was the nature of the stick. Rather than being constructed of wood or paper, it appeared to be fashioned from some sort of hollow reed material, of the type one might find in a botanical specimen or craft supply. Examining the stick, she noted that the hollow interior showed evidence of having contained liquid at some point. Traces of a clear, viscous substance remained on the interior walls, and a thin needle mark visible at the base of the stick suggested the method by which the poison had been introduced. Someone had carefully prepared the stick itself as a delivery mechanism, filling it with cyanide solution that would remain hidden within the hollow interior until the heat of the mouth and the contact with digestive processes caused the solution to seep into the apple's chocolate coating, poisoning any who consumed it. This was no crime of passion, Miss Marple reflected. This was a crime of considerable planning and technical sophistication. Whoever had prepared this chocolate apple had done so with full knowledge of the effect it would produce, and with reasonable certainty that Miss Constance Whitmore would be the one to consume it. As she examined the stick more carefully, she noted something that might have been overlooked by a less meticulous observer. A maker's mark, faint but legible, indicating that the stick had been fashioned by hand rather than mass-produced. Moreover, there were slight variations in the reed's composition and colouring that suggested multiple sticks from different sources had been used for the apples in that batch. She turned to the laboratory assistant who had permitted her access. These chocolate apples came from Delightful Confections, the bakery on Park Street. Yes, the assistant confirmed. The bakery is quite well regarded, particularly for their specialty items. The head baker is a woman named Catherine Hewitt, who inherited the business from her mother and has maintained its reputation, quite remarkably. Catherine Hewitt, Miss Marple repeated to herself, a name that quite possibly held significance if one possessed the knowledge of how to interpret it. She thanked the assistant for his cooperation and departed the laboratory, with her mind already turning over the various connections that might exist between the retired teacher and those who had recently intersected with her life. Chapter 3. The Student Who Became a Baker. The offices of Thornbury Academy proved surprisingly willing to provide Miss Marple with access to the school's records, particularly once she explained that she was assisting with the investigation into the poisoning, and that understanding Miss Whitmore's professional relationships might prove crucial to identifying a perpetrator. The headmaster himself, a man named Mr. Pemberton, who seemed to view the entire affair as an inconvenient disruption to the school's operations, granted her access to Constance Whitmore's personnel file and student, records spanning several decades. What emerged from these documents was a portrait of a woman who had achieved considerable professional success through means that, upon careful examination, began to appear increasingly questionable. Constance's published essays on creative writing pedagogy had been hailed as innovations in the field, yet Miss Marple noted that each essay seemed to focus on remarkably similar themes and examples, many of which appeared to address problems that would only have confronted writers of particular skill and sophistication. "Curious," she murmured to herself, as she examined a file labelled Creative Breakthroughs in Student Writing. The essay had been published in a prestigious educational journal under Constance's name alone, yet the examples cited seemed to demonstrate a level of literary sophistication that would be remarkable in a student work. Miss Marple cross-referenced the publication date of the essay with Constance's class rosters from that academic year and found something that piqued her interest considerably. One particular student, a girl named Catherine Hewitt, had apparently been in Constance's advanced creative writing seminar during the year the essay had been published. Moreover, Catherine had apparently received a failing grade in the course, despite the fact that other evidence in the file suggested the girl had demonstrated considerable writing ability. Miss Marple requested access to Catherine's complete academic file, which the accommodating headmaster provided without resistance. What she discovered there was both illuminating and disturbing. Catherine Hewitt had attended Thornbury Academy from ages 14 through 18, during which time she had demonstrated exceptional talent in creative writing and literature. Her early compositions had been praised by multiple teachers, and she had won several writing competitions sponsored by prestigious organisations. Yet beginning in her third year, her grades in Missy Constance Whitmore's classes had declined dramatically, despite her continued excellence in other subjects. The final entry in the file revealed the most troubling information. Catherine Hewitt had been expelled during her final year for alleged plagiarism, accused of having submitted work that was not entirely her own creation. The incident had been resolved quietly, the file indicated, and Catherine had been permitted to complete her education at an alternative institution. However, a handwritten note in the margin, apparently added by someone other than the official record keeper, contained a single sentence. The girl's novel submission contained nothing but her own work, a masterpiece of young authorship. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the pieces beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern that was becoming increasingly coherent. A student of exceptional talent, accused of plagiarism by her teacher, expelled from the school, her future derailed. And that same teacher had gone on to publish work that bore suspicious resemblance to the types of writing that the student had been known to produce. That same student, decades later, had become a baker of sufficient skill to be entrusted with creating the special confections for the teacher's retirement celebration. She requested one additional piece of information from the headmaster: Miss Whitmore's publications over the past 2 decades, a comprehensive list if you would be so kind. The headmaster seemed somewhat puzzled by this request, but complied readily enough. As Miss Marple examined the list, she found her suspicions hardening into something approaching certainty. Constance had published a book titled The Emerging Voices, which had won several prestigious awards for its innovative approach to understanding how young writers develop. The book, published 15 years prior, contained a remarkable novel within a novel, a fictional account of a young woman's coming of age that was embedded within the book's theoretical framework. That novel, Miss Marple reflected, bore a striking thematic resemblance to student writing samples in Catherine Hewitt's file. The prose style, the particular metaphorical choices, the structural innovations all suggested the work of a single individual. Yet the book's publication had brought Constance considerable acclaim, additional positions, speaking engagements, and sufficient financial success to retire comfortably at what was apparently a relatively young age for someone who had devoted 40 years to teaching. Miss Marple departed Thornbury Academy with several copies of Constance's publications and a growing certainty that she had identified the motivation for the poisoning. But knowing the motive did not immediately clarify the mechanism or address the question of how Catherine Hewitt had arranged for Constance to consume a poisoned chocolate apple at a public celebration. That would require a more direct conversation with the baker herself. Chapter 4. The Confections of Guilt and Justice. The autumn afternoon was shifting toward evening as Miss Marple made her way to Delightful Confections, the bakery situated on a quiet street in the village centre. The shop presented an appealing facade, with windows displaying an array of pastries, cakes and confections, arranged with an aesthetic sense that suggested considerable attention to detail. Through the glass, she could see several customers browsing the offerings, and behind the counter, a woman of perhaps 35 with dark hair and sharp features, who Miss Marple judged to be Catherine Hewitt. The interior of the shop smelled of chocolate, vanilla, and the warm earthiness of flour and butter. A bell chimed as Miss Marple entered, and Catherine looked up from the counter, where she was arranging a display of petits fours with meticulous care. Her expression shifted from professional pleasantness to something more guarded when she recognized her visitor. "Miss Jane Marple," Catherine said, her tone carrying a note of recognition mixed with uncertainty. "I was wondering whether I might receive a visit from you. You know, then, what occurred at the Academy?" Miss Marple replied, moving to examine the bakery's display cases with apparent interest. "I know what was done, Catherine. What I am less certain of is whether what was done was justified or merely criminal." Catherine set down her pastry bag and moved toward the shop's rear door. "It's nearly closing time. Perhaps we might speak more privately in the kitchen." Miss Marple followed the younger woman through a swinging door into a space that was substantially larger than the shopfront suggested. Industrial ovens lined one wall, and various workstations contained the apparatus of serious baking. Several assistants were completing the day's final preparations, and Catherine gestured for them to depart early, claiming she needed to complete inventory. Once they were alone, Catherine moved to a small table where two chairs faced each other across a worn wooden surface. "Sit," she said, not unkindly. "You've come to determine whether I am guilty of the crime that the police have surely begun to suspect was committed at the Academy." "I've come to understand," Miss Marple replied, settling herself in one of the chairs. "Understanding and judgment are quite different matters, I've found over many years of observation." Catherine's bitter laugh echoed through the kitchen. "Judgment? Yes, Miss Constance Whitmore was quite skilled at judgment, wasn't she? She judged me a plagiarist when I was 17 years old, destroyed my academic reputation, ensured that I could not attend the university, could not pursue the literary career that I had dreamed of since childhood, all because my writing was too good, too threatening to her carefully constructed image of herself as a mentor to extraordinary talent. "Tell me what truly occurred," Miss Marple said gently. "The history between you and Miss Whitmore appears to extend beyond a simple academic disagreement." Catherine rose from her chair and moved to stand before a large mirror that hung on the kitchen wall, examining her own reflection with an expression of mingled regret and defiance. "My novel was exceptional, Miss Marple. I was 17, and I had written something that deserved to be published, deserved to be read. I submitted it to the Academy's annual literary competition, where Miss Whitmore served as judge. She selected it as the winner, and was scheduled to present it at the ceremony before the entire school and the gathered families. I don't need to tell you what happened next. You've seen the files. She accused me of plagiarism, claimed that work of such sophistication could not possibly have been produced by a teenager. She convinced the headmaster that I had stolen passages from published works. No evidence existed, but her reputation was sufficient to ensure that my word was worthless against hers. My parents removed me from the school rather than permit me to face continued scrutiny. I completed my education in secret and worked as a clerk in an office, not because I lacked talent, but because I lacked credibility." "And then?" Miss Marple prompted, sensing there was more to the story. "And then I discovered the truth," Catherine continued, her voice sharp with remembered anger. 5 years after my expulsion, I saw her book published. The Emerging Voices, it was called, and there, embedded within the theoretical discussion, was my novel. Not my novel precisely, but a work so similar in theme, structure and prose style that there could be no question of coincidence. She had stolen my work, or at least the essence of it, and used it to launch a career of considerable prominence. Miss Marple absorbed this information with careful attention. Did you attempt to expose this theft? Did you provide evidence to the authorities? Catherine's expression hardened. I tried. I contacted the publisher, presented my original manuscript, explained the chronology of events. But by then, 15 years had passed. Her book was established as an innovative work of scholarship. I was a baker with no university credentials and no published work of my own. Who would believe that the failed student accused of plagiarism was actually the victim of plagiarism? The irony was not lost on anyone involved. So you decided to take justice into your own hands, Miss Marple said quietly. When the Academy announced its celebration of Miss Whitmore's retirement, you saw an opportunity. You were already the preferred baker for Academy events, a natural choice for the catering. You prepared something special, something that would ensure Miss Whitmore would consume it, a chocolate apple filled with death. Catherine's expression shifted towards something approaching defiance mixed with exhaustion. I prepared 40 chocolate apples for that celebration, Miss Marple. Only one of them contained poison, and I made certain, through careful observation and genuine confidence, that Miss Constance Whitmore would select that particular apple. I didn't poison the apple to harm innocent people. I poisoned it because some thefts can only be answered with permanent justice. But you failed, Miss Marple observed. Miss Whitmore survived. Catherine's shoulders sagged slightly. Yes, the dosage, I believe, was insufficient. I had no experience with such matters and feared I might inadvertently harm others if I prepared the poison too concentrated. I erred on the side of caution, never imagining that caution would result in her continued existence. The police will arrive to arrest you within the hour, Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. The evidence pointing to you is substantial. The chocolate apples from your bakery, the poison introduced through a stick fashioned by hand, the history of your expulsion, your knowledge of confectionery chemistry that would permit introduction of toxic substances. All of it points unmistakably toward you. I know, Catherine said simply. I've known since she collapsed that I would likely be discovered. But I wanted her to suffer as I have suffered. I wanted her to experience the feeling of her own life being stolen, if only for a few hours. Is that truly so terrible? A question for judges and juries to answer, Miss Marple replied. Though I confess that I find myself profoundly sympathetic to your history, Catherine, what was done to you was unjust. What you have done, however understandable its motivation, cannot be similarly justified. The two wrongs do not align themselves into righteousness. Chapter 5. The Inspector's Certainty Masks Complexity. Inspector Slack arrived at Delightful Confections within the hour, accompanied by 2 uniformed constables and an expression of professional satisfaction that suggested the case was moving toward its predetermined conclusion with reassuring swiftness. Catherine Hewitt was arrested on suspicion of attempted murder, her property was seized for examination, and her confessions regarding her history with Miss Constance Whitmore were documented with the thoroughness that police procedure demanded. Yet, as Miss Marple observed the proceedings with her characteristic attention, she found herself increasingly troubled by certain elements of the case that seemed not to align properly with the established narrative. She approached Inspector Slack as the constables were preparing to transport Catherine to the police station for formal processing. "Inspector," she said gently, "might I trouble you with a few observations regarding the evidence?" The inspector turned to her with the patience of a professional who had learned to tolerate the interventions of civilian observers, though his expression suggested he considered such interventions largely irrelevant to the established facts. "Of course, Miss Marple. You have been quite helpful in this investigation. However, I believe we have achieved sufficient clarity regarding the perpetrator's identity and motivation. The case appears remarkably straightforward. Catherine Hewitt, expelled from the Academy years prior, bearing a grudge, employed as the Academy's preferred baker, positioned to poison her former teacher. The mechanics are clear, the motive is established, the opportunity was present. Yet there are certain peculiarities, Miss Marple ventured, that merit closer examination. For instance, the chocolate apples were prepared by the bakery staff some days before the celebration. Multiple individuals had access to them. The bakery received multiple orders for similar confections during the same period. How precisely did Catherine ensure that the poisoned apple would remain isolated and that Miss Whitmore would select that particular apple rather than any other. Slack's expression suggested he had not previously considered this complication. She simply, the inspector began, then paused. She made a choice regarding which apple to poison, understanding the risks involved. Catherine Hewitt is clearly willing to accept considerable uncertainty in the service of her revenge. But is she? Miss Marple pressed gently. A woman intelligent enough to conceive of such an elaborate scheme and sophisticated enough to execute it, would she truly rely on such an element of chance? Moreover, Inspector, I wonder whether you have examined the precise nature of the poison employed. The cyanide introduced into the apple stick, how was it obtained? Surely that represents a crucial piece of evidence. Slack frowned. We are investigating that matter. Cyanide is not a substance that is easily obtained. The source of the poison must be identified. A request has been sent to all local chemists and suppliers of laboratory materials. Yet, Catherine Hewitt is a baker, not a chemist. Where would she obtain pure cyanide? Miss Marple's question hung in the air, and she observed with satisfaction how the inspector's certainty began to erode slightly. I confess I have not fully determined that aspect of the investigation, he admitted. However, that does not necessarily invalidate her guilt. Individuals can acquire poisons through various means, often quite illicit. It is possible that Catherine Hewitt obtained the poison through an illegal source. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though I have spent a lifetime observing human nature and crime, and I have found that those guilty of such careful premeditation typically leave evidence of their preparation, evidence of acquiring the poison, establishing contact with illicit suppliers, conducting experiments regarding dosage. Have you discovered such evidence in Catherine's residence or business? The inspector appeared to recognize that he had not previously given sufficient consideration to these questions. I will conduct a thorough search, he said, with somewhat diminished certainty. But Miss Marple, surely you are not suggesting that Catherine is innocent of this crime? Her motive is undeniable. Her access to the chocolate apples was exclusive. Her history with the victim is established. I am suggesting that certainty, however satisfying it might be, often conceals important complications, Miss Marple replied. Catherine Hewitt may indeed be guilty of this crime. However, she may also be guilty of confessing to a crime she did not commit, because the crime provided an outlet for emotions she has harbored for decades. I wonder whether you might permit me to examine the bakery's records and to interview certain individuals who were present at the celebration. Slack appeared reluctant, but recognized that refusing such a request might create complications if it subsequently emerged that Miss Marple's suspicions held merit. Very well, he said finally, but I trust you will report any significant discoveries to my office immediately. Miss Marple nodded and departed the bakery with her mind already turning over the evidence with a increased intensity. She had recognized something in Catherine's confession that troubled her profoundly. The girl had been too willing to accept guilt, too eager to confirm the narrative that the police had constructed. There was something in that eagerness that suggested Catherine was protecting someone, or protecting a truth that was rather more complex than a simple crime of passion executed through baked goods. Chapter 6. The Sticks That Tell Their Own Stories. The laboratory that Inspector Slack maintained in connection with the police station was a modest affair, but sufficient for basic forensic examinations. The chocolate apple stick, preserved as evidence, rested on a metal table under the examination of a forensic specialist named Dr. Hartley, a man of perhaps 50 with the patient demeanour of someone accustomed to extracting truth from physical objects. Miss Marple had requested permission to observe Dr. Hartley's examination, and the inspector had reluctantly granted. Her access, apparently deciding that her continued participation might prove useful rather than merely obstructive. The stick itself, when examined closely, revealed several features of considerable interest. The reed material, Dr. Hartley explained, pointing to various aspects of the hollow interior with a small magnifying glass, suggests that this was fashioned by someone with knowledge of botanical materials. Not the sort of knowledge a baker would typically possess, but perhaps the knowledge one might acquire in certain academic contexts. For instance, someone who had studied botany, or perhaps biology or chemistry in a school or university setting. Moreover, the hollow chamber is quite sophisticated in its construction, Miss Marple observed, leaning forward to examine the interior more closely. The poison would have required a precise mechanism for its release. Heat alone would not have been sufficient to cause the cyanide to seep through the chocolate coating. A deliberate breach or a trigger mechanism of some sort would have been necessary. Dr. Hartley nodded approvingly. Precisely. The individual who created this stick possessed considerable technical knowledge. The cyanide was suspended in a liquid medium that would have remained stable for an extended period. Only when the stick was introduced into the mouth, where saliva and heat would have activated a chemical reagent embedded within the stick itself, would the poison have begun to release into the surrounding chocolate. A chemistry student, Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully, or someone with access to chemistry education and laboratory supplies. She turned to face Inspector Slack, who had been observing this exchange with decreasing satisfaction. Inspector, I wonder whether you might have investigated whether anyone other than Catherine Hewitt possessed the technical knowledge necessary to create such a sophisticated delivery mechanism, someone whose training in chemistry might have been quite extensive and quite recent. Slack's expression hardened. You are suggesting, Miss Marple, that someone other than Catherine Hewitt created the poisoned stick, a person who then introduced it into a chocolate apple that was destined for the Academy celebration? Yes, she said quietly. I believe that is precisely what occurred. Catherine confessed to a crime she may not have committed, driven by her own desire for vengeance and her guilt over harbouring murderous feelings toward Miss Whitmore. But the person who actually prepared the poison, the person who possessed both the knowledge and the access necessary to create such a delivery mechanism, that was someone else entirely. Someone currently employed at Thornbury Academy, if my suspicions prove accurate. Chapter 7. The Teacher Who Knew Too Much. The next morning found Miss Marple in the company of Inspector Slack, arriving at Thornbury Academy with the intention of conducting interviews with the teaching staff regarding their knowledge of chemistry, laboratory equipment, and their individual relationships with Miss Constance Whitmore. The headmaster appeared considerably less accommodating than he had been during their previous visit, viewing the renewed investigation with transparent irritation. The inspector, however, possessed sufficient authority to override the headmaster's protestations. We require access to all staff members who might possess specialized knowledge of chemistry or laboratory procedures, Slack announced. Additionally, we will need to examine any records regarding access to school laboratory facilities, particularly during evening hours when the facilities might not have been under direct supervision. This proved to be a productive line of inquiry. Within the hour, Inspector Slack and his assistants had identified 2 members of the teaching staff who possessed significant chemistry training. The first was a man named Professor Hartwell, who taught advanced chemistry and maintained the school's laboratory facilities. The second was considerably more interesting to Miss Marple, a woman named Dr. Laura Ashford, who taught literature and composition, held a doctorate in chemistry from Oxford University, a qualification she apparently had not deemed necessary to mention when applying for her current position. Dr. Ashford, Miss Marple recalled, was the same woman who had exchanged such barbed remarks with Miss Constance Whitmore at the retirement celebration. The young teacher whose expression had been one of carefully controlled anger when greeting the retiring headmistress. This discovery appeared to trigger something in the inspector's mind, and he requested that Dr. Ashford be brought to his temporary office for questioning. Dr. Ashford arrived with the demeanour of someone prepared to cooperate fully with official inquiries. She was indeed the woman Miss Marple had observed at the celebration, with dark hair and sharp features that conveyed intelligence and intensity in equal measure. However, her expression now suggested apprehension, rather than the satisfaction Miss Marple had noted previously. Dr. Ashford, Inspector Slack began without preamble, I notice from the school's records that you possess a doctorate in chemistry, yet your position here is as a literature instructor. Why did you choose to pursue such a divergent career path? Laura appeared momentarily disconcerted by the question. I found that my interests evolved over time, Inspector. Chemistry is an intellectually satisfying discipline, but I discovered that I had a genuine passion for literature and for teaching young people to appreciate and create literary works. I felt that my chemistry background might actually be beneficial in teaching composition, providing me with a rigorous analytical approach to understanding literary structure. A reasonable answer, but Miss Marple found herself wondering whether it represented the complete truth. She observed carefully as the inspector continued his questioning, noting how Laura's responses became progressively more guarded as the line of inquiry turned toward her interactions with Miss Constance Whitmore. "You were a student here," Miss Marple said gently, turning to address Laura directly. "Were you not one of Miss Whitmore's pupils?" Laura's expression shifted, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure appeared threatened. "Yes. I had Miss Whitmore for advanced composition during my final 2 years at the Academy. She was an exceptional teacher." "Exceptional in what way?" Miss Marple pressed. Laura rose from her chair and moved to the window, where the autumn garden was visible beyond the glass. "She was exceptional at inspiring despair, Miss Marple. She possessed the remarkable ability to convince young people that their creative aspirations were naive, their talents insufficient, their ambitions misplaced. I submitted a short story to her during my final year, a piece I felt confident about that I believed represented some of my best work. She returned it with a single comment. This demonstrates considerable technical competence, but lacks the spark of genuine literary gift. You might find satisfaction in academic study of literature, rather than in attempting to create it." "That must have been difficult," Miss Marple observed. Laura laughed, though without humour. "It was devastating. I nearly abandoned my plans to pursue higher education entirely. But I discovered, some years later, that she had apparently used elements of my story in one of her published essays. Not my story precisely, but enough of my ideas, my observations, my unique perspective that I recognized it immediately. Just as countless other young writers have recognized their own work reflected in her publications." "How many?" Inspector Slack inquired sharply. "How many of your fellow students do you believe had work appropriated by Miss Whitmore?" Laura turned to face the inspector directly. "I know of at least 5. 5? And you did not report this to the authorities?" Laura's laugh was bitter. "Report her to whom, Inspector? The headmaster who benefited from her reputation bringing prestige to the Academy? The publisher who profited from her innovative work? No one listens when a young person accuses an established educator of theft. No one believes that someone of Miss Whitmore's stature would need to steal from her students." "Then how," Inspector Slack pressed, "did you come to know about this chemistry stick, the poison delivery mechanism that required considerable technical knowledge to create?" Laura's expression became shuttered. "I don't know what you mean." But Miss Marple did. She perceived in that moment the full scope of what had occurred. Laura Ashford had trained in chemistry, had maintained access to the school's laboratory facilities, and had possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to create the poisoned stick. Yet she had chosen not to use it herself. Instead, she had provided it to Catherine Hewitt, knowing that Catherine's history with Miss Whitmore, Catherine's documented resentment, would make Catherine the obvious suspect if poisoning was discovered. "You found Catherine, didn't you?" Miss Marple said quietly. "You discovered that Catherine, too, had been victimized by Miss Whitmore, and recognizing a kindred spirit, someone whose suffering mirrored your own, you provided her with the means to enact the vengeance that you both desired." Laura's composure crumbled entirely. She sank back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. Catherine didn't know what she was accepting. I told her it was a simple gift, a chocolate apple stick that I had crafted to replace the ordinary ones, something special for the celebration. I made certain to select the apple myself to ensure that Miss Whitmore would receive the poisoned one. Catherine was innocent of the actual crime, Inspector. I used her anger, exploited her pain, and gave her the instrument of murder without her knowledge or consent. Chapter 8. The Scholar of Deception Revealed. The revelation that Dr. Laura Ashford had been the true architect of the poisoning transformed the investigation entirely. Inspector Slack, his earlier certainty vindicated though in a direction quite different from his initial assumptions, moved swiftly to gather evidence supporting Laura's involvement. Her access to the school laboratory, records of her presence in the facility during the weeks prior to the celebration, and examination of materials remaining in her private quarters all confirmed her capacity to have created the poisoned stick. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly interested in a question that extended beyond the mechanical aspects of the crime. Why had Laura, possessing the knowledge and opportunity to poison Miss Whitmore directly, chosen instead to involve Catherine and to construct an elaborate scheme that risked exposure? The answer, she suspected, lay in understanding the psychological depth of what had been set in motion. She requested a private conversation with Laura before the young teacher was transported to the police station for formal processing. Inspector Slack, perhaps recognizing that Miss Marple's insights had proven valuable throughout the investigation, granted this request with minimal resistance. "Laura," Miss Marple said, settling herself in the chair across from the younger woman in the headmaster's quiet office, "I wonder whether you might help me understand the reasoning that led you to such an extraordinary course of action. You possessed the means to poison Miss Whitmore yourself. You possessed the knowledge and opportunity. Yet instead, you chose to involve Catherine Hewitt, accepting considerable risk to your own liberty in the process. Why?" Laura's expression was one of profound exhaustion, as though she had been carrying an enormous weight that was only now being set down. "Because Miss Marple," I discovered, in Catherine's story a reflection of my own pain, but magnified 1,000-fold. Catherine had been a student of genuine exceptional talent. Her novel was extraordinary, so much so that I had sought it out after I learned of her expulsion. I read it in manuscript form, years after she had left the school. It was magnificent, Miss Marple, the work of someone with profound insight into human nature, with technical facility that most published writers never achieve. And Miss Whitmore had stolen it, Miss Marple said gently. She had taken Catherine's work, woven it into her own publication, and used it to advance her career. Yes, and in doing so, she had not merely stolen words or ideas. She had stolen Catherine's future. She had stolen the possibility that Catherine would have the opportunity to develop her talents, to find her voice as a writer, to achieve the recognition that her work deserved. My own losses, Miss Marple, while significant, were merely losses of validation, of recognition, of academic advancement. Catherine's losses were infinitely more profound. When did you determine to poison her? When I realized that Catherine still lived in this village, that she had become the baker who provided catering for academy events. When I learned that she would be providing the refreshments for Miss Whitmore's retirement celebration. It seemed like an opportunity offered by Providence, Miss Marple, a chance to provide Catherine with the means to enact the justice that had been denied to her for so many years. But Catherine did not actually poison Miss Whitmore, Miss Marple observed. She consumed a chocolate apple herself, believing she had done so. But the poisoned apple was one you selected and ensured she would receive. Why provide her with the instrument of her own vengeance if you intended to select it yourself? Because, Laura said, her voice becoming barely audible, I wanted her to believe that she had done it. I wanted her to experience the full weight of taking action against the person who had wronged her, to understand that she was capable of striking back, of achieving the justice that the world had denied her. And then, after that moment passed, after the initial satisfaction of revenge had been achieved, I intended to provide evidence to the police pointing clearly toward my own involvement. I intended to confess, to ensure that Catherine would be exonerated, that she would be freed from the burden of guilt that she had not actually earned. "But you did not expect Miss Whitmore to survive," Miss Marple said quietly. The dosage was insufficient. Had it been stronger, Catherine might have spent the remainder of her life believing herself to be a murderer, carrying a guilt that was not rightfully hers. "That is true," Laura acknowledged, "though I cannot entirely regret her survival. I do not possess the kind of certainty that murder requires. I'm not a person who believes that death is a fitting punishment for plagiarism, however deliberate and however damaging. I am simply a person who loves literature, who recognizes genius, and who could not tolerate the thought that Catherine's genius would be forever obscured by the shameful mark that Miss Whitmore had placed upon her character." Chapter 9. The final examination of evidence and motive. The official investigation into the poisoning of Miss Constance Whitmore concluded with the arrest of Dr. Laura Ashford on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy. Catherine Hewitt was exonerated and released following a brief period of detention, her confession rendered moot by the revelation that she had been an unwitting participant in a scheme designed by someone else. Yet for Miss Marple, the case was not entirely concluded. She found herself drawn back to Thornbury Academy, where she requested a final conversation with Miss Constance Whitmore. The retired teacher had recovered sufficiently to receive visitors, though the poisoning had left her permanently. Weakened, her recovery incomplete. Miss Marple discovered Constance in her private office, her complexion still bearing the pallor of someone who had experienced profound physical trauma. The older woman appeared unsurprised to see her visitor, as though she had anticipated that Miss Marple would eventually seek a final confrontation. "You know," Constance said without preamble, "what I did. You understand the extent of my thefts." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair across from the retired teacher's desk. "I know a considerable amount, yes. I have examined your publications, reviewed the original work of multiple students across several decades, identified the patterns of appropriation that characterize your career. It is a remarkable testament to human rationalization that you managed to convince yourself that what you were doing represented anything other than calculated theft." Constance's laugh was hollow. "I was not convinced of that at any point, Miss Marple. I was perfectly aware of what I was doing. I knew that Catherine Hewitt had written work of exceptional quality. I knew that other students possessed talents that exceeded my own. Yet I also knew that their youth, their lack of credentials, their vulnerable position as students would ensure that they could never successfully challenge my appropriation of their work." "Then you are admitting to decades of deliberate plagiarism?" "Yes," Constance replied without hesitation. "I'm admitting to exactly that. My own creative capacities were adequate but not remarkable. I was a competent teacher, an effective administrator, but I was not a writer of genius. Yet I desired to be known as such. I desired the recognition, the accolades, the financial rewards that accompany such distinction. So I took what others had created and claimed it as my own." "And now," Miss Marple inquired gently, "now you have been poisoned by a former student, survived through what appears to be either divine intervention or chemical miscalculation, and will presumably face considerable consequences for your professional misconduct. How do you contemplate those developments?" Constance rose from her chair and moved to the window, where the academy gardens were visible beneath the afternoon light. "I do not believe I deserve forgiveness, Miss Marple. The damage I have done to Catherine Hewitt, to Laura Ashford, to countless other young writers, whose work I appropriated, and whose careers I damaged, that damage cannot be repaired by my remorse. I do believe, however, that I deserve to be punished, not by poison perhaps, but by exposure, by the withdrawal of the honours and recognition I accumulated through theft, by the knowledge that my life's work has been founded upon lies." "It is a curious development," Miss Marple observed, "that the only attempt to hold you accountable for your crimes came from someone like Laura, someone motivated by genuine care for a victim rather than by personal grievance. Catherine did not poison you. Catherine wanted to, perhaps, but when presented with the opportunity, she chose not to. It was Laura who attempted to enforce justice, motivated not by hatred of you, but by love for Catherine." Constance turned back to face her visitor, and for the first time her expression appeared to contain genuine emotion. "I have reflected extensively on that development during my recovery, Miss Marple. The irony is not lost upon me. The only person willing to attempt my murder was someone whose primary motivation was not revenge but compassion. It is a judgment upon my character that I find more devastating than the poison itself." Chapter 10. The Autumn Resolution and the Scholar's Redemption. The trial of Dr. Laura Ashford occupied considerable space in the newspapers for several weeks, as the case presented all the elements that the public found endlessly fascinating. A retiring teacher accused of decades of plagiarism, a former student driven to poison in defense of a friend, a complex web of theft, revenge, and moral ambiguity that defied easy categorization as a simple matter of justice. Yet what dominated the proceedings was not the poisoning itself, but the revelation of Constance Whitmore's decades-long appropriation of student work. Publishers demanded the return of advances paid for books whose authorship was now in question. Universities that had honoured Constance withdrew their accolades. Her peers in the literary world engaged in retrospective examination of her published work, discovering that what had been hailed as innovation was often merely the careful reworking of students' creations. Miss Marple attended several days of the trial, observing the proceedings with her characteristic intensity. She watched as Laura Ashford, pale and composed, listened to testimony regarding her actions. She observed Constance Whitmore, no longer present but somehow central to the case, being systematically dismantled by the revelations of her professional dishonesty. The judge, in his final remarks before delivering his sentence, appeared to grapple with the genuine complexity of the case. "You have attempted the murder of Miss Constance Whitmore," he said to Laura, "an act for which substantial punishment is required. Yet you have also served, perhaps unintentionally, as an instrument through which a profound injustice has been exposed. Catherine Hewitt has been restored to her rightful place as the author of work that had been stolen from her. Countless other students have had their grievances validated. Miss Whitmore's entire professional legacy has been called into question. The sentence I deliver acknowledges both the severity of your crime and the unintended consequences of its attempted commission." Laura Ashford received a sentence of 12 years' imprisonment, reduced from what might otherwise have been a more substantial term, due to the judge's apparent recognition that her motives, while criminal in their expression, had been rooted in genuine moral conviction rather than in personal malice. Catherine Hewitt, in the months following the trial, published her original novel under her own name. It was hailed by critics as a remarkable work of literary art, decades late in its arrival, but no less powerful for that delay. Several universities that had previously rejected her application as a student now offered her scholarships to pursue advanced studies in creative writing. She eventually abandoned the bakery business and became a published novelist of considerable reputation. Miss Marple received a letter from Catherine some 6 months after the trial's conclusion. The letter expressed gratitude for Miss Marple's role in uncovering the truth about what had transpired, and contained a dedication to be included in Catherine's second novel. To Miss Jane Marple, who understands that justice often arrives in unexpected forms, and that sometimes the greatest crimes are those committed in the service of recognized excellence. The novel that followed the letter became something of a sensation, a sophisticated examination of plagiarism, theft, and the nature of artistic creation. Critics recognized in it clear echoes of the trial that had inspired it, though Catherine had transformed the actual events into something more universal, more profound, more genuinely artistic than the mere facts could have provided. As for Miss Marple herself, she returned to her quiet village life with the satisfaction of knowing that truth, however circuitously, had eventually prevailed. She received a visit from Margaret Hastings, her old friend from Thornbury Academy, who came to thank her for her role in exposing the plagiarism that had been perpetrated over so many years. "I confess I am ashamed," Margaret said, settling herself with tea in Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room. "I worked alongside Constance for nearly 30 years. I should have noticed something amiss. I should have recognized that her output was impossible for someone of her actual creative capacity." "You could not have known," Miss Marple replied gently. Constance possessed the advantages of reputation, position, and confidence. Those things are remarkably effective at preventing scrutiny. She had constructed an elaborate deception, and she had benefited from the natural inclination of people to accept the surface presentation of someone who occupies a position of authority and respect. "Still," Margaret said, "I've been reflecting on the nature of her crimes and the circumstances that permitted them. I wonder whether, had I paid closer attention, had I been more sceptical of her accomplishments, whether I might have prevented considerable suffering for the young people whose work she appropriated. That is the burden that those who recognize injustice must carry," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "The knowledge that prevention is always superior to remedy, and that our failure to prevent harm often extends that harm far, beyond what it might otherwise have been. Yet we must also recognize that the world rewards deception and punishes truthfulness far too often. Constance succeeded because she was willing to be dishonest, because she was willing to take credit for work that was not her own, because she trusted that her position of authority would protect her from exposure." In the end, Miss Marple reflected, as Margaret departed that afternoon, the case had revealed truths about human nature that extended far beyond the simple matter of poisoning. It had demonstrated that the greatest crimes are often those committed in plain sight, justified by institutions, and supported by those who benefit from the deception. And it had illustrated that justice, when it finally arrives, often comes through unexpected channels, through people motivated not by vengeance but by genuine care for those who have been wronged. The autumn turned to winter, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting and her observations of village life, secure in the knowledge that one small corner of injustice had been set to rights, and that the world, while not perfect, was at least marginally more just than it had been before. Yet she remained vigilant, as always, for the crimes concealed within the everyday deceptions that characterized human interaction. For Miss Marple understood, as few others did, that murder is merely the most obvious manifestation of the malice that humans are capable of harboring toward one another, and that the careful observer might detect the seeds of such malice in the smallest deviations from the expected patterns of human behavior.